On 30th of April 1945, Eva Braun died beside Adolf Hitler in the Führerbunker beneath Berlin. She had been Hitler's companion for over a decade, yet remained largely unknown to the German public until the final days of the war. Her death by cyanide just hours after their marriage ended her story, but left her family to face the aftermath. From middle-class respectability in Munich to the stigma of the Hitler connection, the Braun family experienced a fall unlike any other. In the final weeks of the war, Eva's family watched their world collapse. Her parents, Fritz and Franziska Braun, had lived quietly in Munich throughout the war years, maintaining a facade of ordinary middle-class life despite their daughter's relationship with the Führer. Her sisters, Ilse and Gretl, had both benefited from Eva's position, though in different ways. Gretl had married SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein in June 1944, a union that placed her directly within Hitler's inner circle. Ilse, the eldest sister, had worked as a receptionist at Hitler's personal physician's office, a position she maintained throughout the war. When news reached Munich that Hitler was dead and Berlin had fallen, the Braun family understood immediately what it meant for them. On 5 May 1945, just days before Germany's unconditional surrender, Fritz Braun suffered a fatal heart attack. Some accounts suggest the stress of the collapse, combined with knowledge of what his daughter had become, proved too much. Others point to underlying health conditions. Either way, he did not live to face Allied interrogation. Franziska Braun, Eva's mother, faced the occupation alone. American forces entered Munich on 30th April 1945, the same day Eva died in Berlin. Within weeks, Allied intelligence officers arrived at the Braun family home. They had questions about Eva, about her relationship with Hitler, and about what the family had known. Franziska maintained that Eva had been a private person, that the family had rarely discussed politics, and that they had been kept at a distance from the regime's inner workings. The interrogators were skeptical, but found little evidence of direct involvement. The situation for Gretl Braun Fegelein was far more complicated. Her husband, Hermann Fegelein, had been executed by Hitler's order on 20th April 1945, just 2 days before Eva's death. Fegelein had been caught attempting to desert Berlin in the final days, and Hitler, in a rage, ordered him shot for treason and cowardice. He was Eva's brother-in-law, yet Hitler showed no mercy. Gretl was 8 months pregnant at the time of her husband's execution. On 5 May 1945, the same day her father died, Gretl gave birth to a daughter she named Eva Barbara Fegelein, after her deceased sister. The child was born into a Germany that no longer existed, the daughter of an executed SS officer, and the niece of Adolf Hitler's companion. American authorities located Gretl shortly after the birth. They were interested in her husband's activities, his role in the SS, and his knowledge of war crimes. Gretl was questioned repeatedly, but maintained she had little knowledge of her husband's duties. The Allied occupation brought formal denazification proceedings. Unlike Emmy Goering, who faced serious charges due to her public visibility, the Braun family occupied a strange middle ground. They had been connected to the very top of the Nazi hierarchy, yet they had never held official positions or appeared in propaganda. Eva herself had been kept largely hidden from public view throughout the war, known to few Germans before 1945. Franziska Braun appeared before a denazification tribunal in Munich in 1946. The proceedings focused on what benefits she had received through her daughter's position and whether she had supported the regime. Evidence showed that the family had received financial support, that Eva had given them money and gifts, and that they had lived comfortably during years when most Germans suffered shortages. The tribunal classified Franziska as a Mitläufer, a follower, the lowest category of guilt under the denazification system. She faced no serious penalties beyond the loss of any remaining assets connected to Eva's estate. Gretl's case was more complex. As the widow of an SS Gruppenführer, she faced greater scrutiny. Prosecutors examined her wedding, which had been a lavish affair at the Berghof with Hitler in attendance. They questioned her about her husband's activities and her own knowledge of SS operations. Gretl insisted she had been ignorant of her husband's crimes, that she had married for love, and that she had no political involvement. In 1948, she too was classified as a Mitläufer. The decision reflected both her limited direct involvement and her status as a widow with a young child. Ilse Braun, the eldest sister, faced the lightest scrutiny. Her work as a medical receptionist was deemed non-political, and investigators found no evidence of Nazi party membership or significant benefits from Eva's position. She was quickly cleared and released from any denazification proceedings. The financial situation for the Braun family after 1945 was difficult but not catastrophic. Unlike the Görings, who lost vast estates and art collections, the Brauns had never accumulated significant wealth. Eva had sent money to her parents over the years, but it was modest compared to the fortunes of top Nazi officials. What little remained was seized during Denazification, leaving Franziska and her daughters to rebuild from almost nothing. Franziska Braun spent her remaining years in Munich, living in a small apartment and surviving on a modest pension. She rarely spoke publicly about Eva, and when she did, she portrayed her daughter as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had fallen in love with the wrong man. She maintained that Eva had been apolitical, interested only in fashion, films, and domestic life. This narrative, while self-serving, found some acceptance among those who remembered Eva's absence from public Nazi ceremonies. In the 1950s, as Germany began to rebuild, the Braun name gradually faded from public attention. Unlike the Görings, who remained in the spotlight due to Edda's prominence and Emmy's memoirs, the Braun family sought obscurity. They changed nothing about their name, but they also did nothing to draw attention to themselves. Franziska Braun died in Munich on 13th January 1976, at the age of 96. Her death received minimal press coverage. Gretl Braun-Fegelein's life after the war followed a similar pattern of quiet withdrawal. She raised her daughter Eva Barbara in Munich, working various jobs to support them both. In 1954, she remarried, taking the name Gretl Berlinghoff after her new husband, a businessman named Kurt Berlinghoff. The marriage provided stability, and Gretl's new husband reportedly accepted her past without judgment. She avoided all interviews and public appearances, refusing to discuss either Eva or her first husband. Eva Barbara Fegelein grew up knowing her family history, but living far from its shadow. Her mother chose to tell her the truth about her father and her aunt, but also to emphasize that she bore no responsibility for their actions. Eva Barbara later married and took her husband's name, further distancing herself from both Braun and Fegelein. She lived quietly in Germany, working as a teacher, and like her mother, refused all interview requests. When she died in 1971, at just 26 years old, from cancer, her obituary made no mention of her family connections. Gretl Braun-Berlinghoff outlived both her daughter and her mother. She died in 1987 in Munich, having spent more than 4 decades avoiding any public discussion of her past. In all those years, she gave only one brief interview, in which she stated simply that she had loved her sister but could not defend her choices. Ilse Braun, the eldest sister, lived the longest and most stable life of the 3 Braun children. After the war, she married and settled in Munich, working in administrative roles and raising a family. She maintained contact with Gretl and their mother, but rarely discussed Eva. Friends and neighbors often had no idea of her family connection. When journalists occasionally tracked her down, she politely declined to comment. Ilse died in 1979, having successfully built a life entirely separate from her sister's legacy. The Braun family's response to their history stands in contrast to both the Görings and other prominent Nazi-connected families. While Edda Göring defended her father until her death, and Bettina Göring underwent sterilization to end the line, the Braun family chose a third path: silence. They neither defended nor denounced. They neither celebrated nor dramatically rejected their connection to Hitler. They simply withdrew, choosing obscurity over confrontation with history. This silence extended to Eva's personal effects and correspondence. Unlike Emmy Göring, who published memoirs defending her husband, none of the Braun family published accounts of Eva's life. When historians sought access to Eva's photographs, home movies, and letters in the post-war years, they found that much had been destroyed or lost. What survived often came from Allied archives rather than family cooperation. The photographs that did emerge told a different story than official Nazi propaganda. Eva's home movies from the Berghof showed Hitler in relaxed domestic settings, playing with dogs, entertaining guests, and behaving like an ordinary host. These images complicated the historical record, showing a private dimension to Hitler that sat uneasily beside his public role as dictator and architect of genocide. The Braun family's refusal to contextualize or explain these materials left them open to varied interpretations. In the 1970s and 1980s, as interest in the Third Reich's private dimensions grew, attempts to interview surviving Braun family members intensified. All declined. Gretl's few surviving quotes came from a single conversation with a journalist who managed to reach her by telephone. When asked if she regretted her sister's choices, she replied that Eva was in love, and love makes us blind. She then hung up and never spoke to another journalist again. The Braun family's silence had consequences for historical understanding. Without first-hand accounts, Eva remained an enigma, defined largely by speculation and the judgments of others who had known her. Some historians portrayed her as apolitical and naive, others as complicit in her proximity to evil. The family's refusal to engage meant these interpretations went unchallenged and unrefined by those who knew her best. What emerged from the post-war years was a family that had learned the cost of proximity to power. Unlike the children of other Nazi leaders who sometimes sought to rehabilitate their parents' names or engaged in public debates about guilt and responsibility, the Braun family chose invisibility. They understood that Eva's story would never reflect well on them, that no explanation would satisfy, and that engagement would only prolong their connection to a past they wished to escape. The final chapter of the Braun family story is one of demographic extinction. Eva died childless. Gretl had only one daughter, who died young without children of her own. Ilse had children, but they took their father's name and were raised far from any connection to the Braun legacy. By the end of the 20th century, there were no living direct descendants who carried the name Braun and acknowledged a connection to Eva. This quiet disappearance stands in stark contrast to the sensational end that brought them into history. While Hermann Göring's trial and suicide made his family's story unavoidable, Eva Braun's death in the bunker created a different kind of aftermath. She had never been a public figure, never held official position, never made speeches or appeared in propaganda. Her connection to Hitler had been personal and private, and in the post-war world her family treated it as such. The Braun family's strategy of silence proved in its way effective. By the 21st century, few Germans could name Eva Braun's siblings or describe what happened to them. The family had achieved what Edgar Göring never could. They faded from public consciousness. Whether this represented escape, denial, or simply exhaustion with a burden they never asked to carry remains a question without a clear answer. What remains certain is that the Braun family paid a price for Eva's choices, even if that price was less severe than what others connected to Nazi leadership faced. They lost their father to stress and heartbreak in the war's final days. They lost their financial security and social standing. They lost the ability to speak freely about their own history. And they lost, ultimately, even the desire to defend or explain the sister and daughter whose decisions had shaped their fates. The question of what the Braun family actually knew about Hitler's crimes remains contested. Allied interrogators questioned Franziska and Gretl repeatedly. Both insisted they had been kept in the dark, that Eva never discussed political matters, and that their visits to the Berghof were purely social occasions. One American intelligence report from June 1945 noted that Franziska's denials seemed rehearsed and absolute. Gretl's marriage to Hermann Fegelein provides perhaps the clearest window into the family's complicity through association. Fegelein was deeply involved in war crimes on the Eastern Front, participating in anti-partisan operations that often involved the massacre of civilians. The wedding at the Berghof on 3rd June 1944 was attended by Hitler, Eva, Martin Bormann, and other top Nazi officials, with Heinrich Himmler serving as a witness. After the war, Gretl never publicly acknowledged the implications of that ceremony, describing it simply as "my wedding day." The treatment of the Braun family by post-war German society reveals much about how that society processed its own guilt. In Munich, neighbours knew who they were, but generally left them alone. The Brauns were guilty by association, but not guilty enough to prosecute seriously, and they were silent enough not to provoke controversy. American intelligence maintained files on them well into the 1950s, monitoring their activities and occasionally interviewing them when new information about Hitler or Eva emerged. The disposal of Eva's personal effects became its own complicated story. Allied forces found boxes of photographs, letters, and personal items at the Berghof and Hitler's Munich apartment in 1945. Much of this material was seized as evidence, with originals eventually reaching the National Archives in Washington. Franziska kept a few photographs of Eva as a child, images from before Hitler entered her life. These she guarded carefully, showing them to almost no one. The contrast between the Braun family's silence and the volumes written about Eva by outsiders became increasingly stark as decades passed. Dozens of books appeared claiming to explain who Eva was and what her relationship with Hitler truly meant. The Braun family's refusal to engage meant these narratives developed without challenge from those who knew Eva best. When German journalist Nerin Gun published Eva Braun, Hitler's Mistress in 1973, the family's response was complete silence. This pattern of non-engagement had legal consequences. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, various individuals claimed to possess Eva Braun's jewelry or personal effects, attempting to sell them to collectors. The Braun family could have challenged these sales, but chose not to. Franziska reportedly told a friend that she wanted nothing to do with any of it. By the 1980s, most of the Braun family had died, and those who remained had fully committed to their strategy of silence. When researchers approached Ilse's children with questions, they received polite but firm refusals. The second generation had learned that engagement brought only trouble. The few glimpses into the family's private thoughts came indirectly. A Munich neighbor who lived near Franziska in the 1960s later recalled that the elderly woman seemed haunted by memories she refused to share. She kept to herself, attended church regularly, and avoided any conversation about the past. When neighbors asked innocent questions about her life, she would change the subject or retreat into her apartment. The neighbor remembered her once saying, "Some doors, once closed, should remain closed forever." Gretl's daughter, Eva Barbara, before her early death in 1971, reportedly told a close friend that carrying the Braun name felt like wearing a mark that never fades. She had considered changing her surname entirely, but ultimately decided against it, perhaps understanding that running from identity achieves nothing. Her tragic death from cancer at 26 meant she never had to make the harder choices her mother and grandmother faced about how to live with history's weight. In recent years, historians have attempted to reassess Eva Braun's role and significance. The Braun family's silence means these debates continue without resolution. Unlike the descendants of other Nazi figures who engaged publicly with their legacies, the Braun descendants simply removed themselves from the conversation entirely. The material reality of the Braun family's post-war existence tells its own story of decline. Before 1945, they had lived comfortably, if not lavishly. Fritz Braun's modest income as a school teacher had been supplemented by Eva's generous gifts, money that arrived regularly from Berlin throughout the war years. The family never discussed the source openly, maintaining the fiction that Eva worked as a photographer's assistant, though everyone understood the truth. After Fritz's death and the Allied occupation, this financial support vanished overnight. Franziska's apartment in Munich's Schwabing district, where she lived from 1946 until her death in 1976, measured barely 40 square meters. The building had survived the Allied bombing raids that destroyed much of the city, but its walls bore scars from shrapnel and its windows had been replaced with cheaper materials. She shared a bathroom with 3 other families on her floor, a dramatic fall from the comfortable bourgeois existence she had known. Her pension as a teacher's widow provided enough for basic necessities, but little more. The psychological toll proved harder to quantify, but more persistent than material hardship. Franziska developed what her neighbors described as an obsessive need for privacy. She hung heavy curtains that remained drawn even during the day. She installed multiple locks on her door, checking them repeatedly before leaving and upon returning. When the doorbell rang unexpectedly, she would freeze, waiting in silence until the visitor left. This behavior, which might have been dismissed as eccentricity in someone else, carried different weight for a woman whose daughter had been Hitler's companion. Gretl's struggles manifested differently. After her remarriage to Kurt Berlinghoff in 1954, she attempted to construct a normal life, but the foundation remained unstable. Her daughter, Eva Barbara, later confided to a school friend that her mother suffered from recurring nightmares, waking in the middle of the night crying for her sister. Kurt Berlinghoff, by all accounts a kind and patient man, understood that his wife carried wounds that would never fully heal. He asked few questions about her past and made clear to friends that the subject was closed. The social dynamics surrounding the Braun family in post-war Munich reflected Germany's broader struggle with its recent history. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was curiosity mixed with judgment. Neighbors whispered, strangers stared, and occasionally someone would confront Franziska on the street, demanding to know what she had known, what she had done, whether she felt guilt or shame. These encounters became less frequent as years passed, but they never entirely ceased. As late as 1970, a university student researching the Third Reich knocked on Franziska's door, hoping for an interview. She opened the door just wide enough to say, "I have nothing to tell you," before closing it again. The children born into the family after the war inherited a complicated legacy. Ilse's 3 children grew up knowing their aunt had been Eva Braun, but their parents worked hard to ensure this knowledge didn't define them. They used their father's surname Führer, and their mother instructed them never to discuss the connection at school. One of Ilse's sons mentioned it to a classmate in the early 1960s. He came home to find his mother in tears, terrified that the family's hard-won anonymity would shatter. Financial necessity forced Gretl to work various jobs throughout the 1950s. She cleaned houses, worked as a seamstress, and eventually found steadier employment as a shop assistant in a department store. Her employers never learned her background, and her co-workers knew her simply as Gretl, a war widow raising a daughter alone. This anonymity, carefully constructed and jealously guarded, represented a kind of freedom. For 8 hours a day, she could be someone other than Eva Braun's sister. The question of complicity haunted the family in ways both obvious and subtle. Were they complicit by accepting Eva's money? By attending her wedding to Hitler? By remaining silent about what they suspected or knew? Allied interrogators had pressed these questions in 1945 and 1946, but the legal proceedings ended quickly. The moral questions proved more enduring. Franziska attended Mass regularly in her final decades, and a priest who knew her later recalled that she often asked about forgiveness for sins committed by association. Could one be forgiven for loving someone who had done unforgivable things? The priest had no answer that satisfied her. Documents declassified in the 1990s revealed that American intelligence maintained surveillance on the Braun family longer than previously known. Reports from as late as 1959 noted Franziska's movements, recorded visitors to her apartment, and tracked correspondence. The files contain nothing incriminating, only the mundane details of an elderly woman's quiet life, but they demonstrate how thoroughly the shadow of history followed her. The Americans were looking for hidden Nazi networks, concealed assets, or evidence of ongoing connections to former SS members. They found none of these things, only a broken family trying to survive. The disposal of Eva's belongings created lasting resentment within the family. Much had been seized by Allied forces, but some items remained in the family's possession immediately after the war. Franziska reportedly destroyed photographs, letters, and a diary that Eva had kept as a teenager. She burned them in her apartment's small stove during the winter of 1945-1946, watching each page turn to ash. Gretl later expressed regret about this destruction, suggesting they might have provided evidence of Eva's humanity, proof that she had been more than Hitler's shadow. Franziska disagreed, believing that some connections were better erased completely. In the end, the story of Eva Braun's family is a story of retreat. They retreated from public life, from historical engagement, and from the very name that connected them to one of history's darkest chapters. Unlike the Goerings, who fought to defend their legacy, or the Himmlers, who struggled to escape theirs, the Brauns simply disappeared. They chose silence over confrontation, obscurity over clarity, and ultimately, erasure over acknowledgement. Whether this represented wisdom, cowardice, or simple exhaustion remains a question that will never be answered, because those who could have answered it chose, definitively and finally, not to speak.